Tory MPs want to scrap the ban on new oil boilers, which seems like a very niche thing, except it affects about 1.7 million people, mostly in rural communities.
Yeah, it's a big expense.
Yes,
it's a big expense.
And they want them to go onto these, what they call the other...
heat pumps. Yeah.
They cost...
About 10 grand.
And there's no grants involved, is there, at the moment?
And there's no infrastructure to put them in either. I mean, if you try to go online
and say, get me a heat pump...
But the 1.7 million people with oil boilers aren't going to lose them. You'll still be able to use them. It's all about going forward, putting new ones in. Now, there's got to be a discussion. Is it the right way to go ahead, keep fitting them if we're going to try to get off fossil fuels?
But they're calling it the sort of ULEZ trap.
Well, look, the ULEZ extension delivered a by-election victory for the Tories in Uxbridge. So they have now obviously concluded that the environment can be another wedge issue. You're looking for wedge issues in this election. And also, it's combined with a cost of living crisis. If you have to replace your old car, if you have to potentially replace your boiler, if you're facing other costs, then that is something that can have an impact. But the irony is, of course, that the Tories and the Labour government before them as well have a fantastic record in terms of making progress towards net zero. I mean, we've effectively eliminated the use of fossil coal for power generation. We've got a fantastic offshore wind farm industry. There's a lot of positive stuff that the government is talking about in terms of success.
78% of our energy is still fossil fuel, though.
We can break away for a second, but to carry this conversation on, we're joined by the Shadow Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh, live from Sheffield. We need to talk to you about migration and also buses. But we've just been discussing the politics of the environment. And the front page of The Sun today is a bit of a challenge for Labour. Keir Starmer has called the actions of Just Stop Oil contemptible. Yvette Cooper said that the attack on the house of Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, last week by Greenpeace was disgraceful. And then it turns out that the Labour candidate in the upcoming by-election in Mid-Bedfordshire, called
Alistair Strathern, who's 33.
Alistair Strathern was on a Greenpeace demonstration a few months ago, dressed as a zombie. Also, he's been at protests about clamping down on Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion disruption. Louise, a by-election is not the kind of thing where you want to have a candidate who is causing difficulty for the party on a very sensitive issue. Is this one you just have to nip in the bud quickly?
Well, look, my understanding is that Alistair was protesting against the Public Order Bill, a bill that people from across the political spectrum and across civil society had expressed concerns with, and indeed that the Labour Party voted against. There's lots of ways to protest peacefully, and that right to peaceful protest absolutely has to be protected in law and as a fundamental right. I know because I've been on both sides. I've protested myself, and as a former police officer, I've policed those protests. And it was very evident during the passage of that bill that there were going to be knock-on consequences, as we saw around the policing of the coronation and of the protests around that. There were some wrongful arrests that were made. So I think Alistair was right to voice those concerns. But Keir Starmer and other members of the Shadow Cabinet and the Labour Party have been very clear in our condemnation of Just Stop Oil's tactics, that it's wrong to block the highway to stop ambulances and other emergency vehicles going through, and that the recent protest of Greenpeace was wrong as well. So I think there's nothing conflicting with that. There's nothing contradictory. And I know that Alistair has put the issues that really matter to the people of Mid-Bedfordshire at the heart of his campaign, including cost of living, rural infrastructure and access to basic public services, which constituents in Mid-Bedfordshire are really struggling to make at the moment. So
he's not broken the law. There's nothing wrong with being a Greenpeace protester if you're not breaking the law, and Just Stop Oil are breaking the law, as were those Greenpeace guys last Friday at the Prime Minister's house. I just wonder whether... do you want a Greenpeace protester being your candidate in a by-election?
Do we want people who have expressed legitimate concerns about the environment and engaged in legitimate protest? I think if we were ruling people out who'd engaged in perfectly legitimate political and protest activity, would be in a very difficult place. He's expressed perfectly legitimate concerns around that piece of legislation. He's engaged in peaceful protest. I think this is a fairly obvious, desperate attempt to align the Labour Party with interests and activities that we have obviously and repeatedly condemned, and I've every confidence in Alistair Southern as an excellent candidate in Mid-Beds.
You want to talk about, interestingly, it is an environmental issue too, about the number of bus routes that have halved, you say, since 2011. The Department of Transport says that those figures are actually misleading, that they've invested £500 million into buses and bus routes. What's your point about bus routes, in the sense that, I mean, if they're spending £500 million, they call your figures misleading. What is it that you're going to do differently?
Well, the traffic commissioners have released data this month that demonstrate that over 50% of routes have been lost since 2011, and in the last year alone, 2,000 routes have been lost across England. The government like to do this a lot, is throw figures around of how much money they've invested in, but it'd be interesting when you have your Tory spokesperson on this morning if they can tell you how many additional routes or how many routes they've saved in that time. Because let me tell you, in Sheffield and everywhere I go across the country, people complain about buses and their access to basic public services, to their local high street, to connecting to their friends and family. And that's the reason I wanted to talk about it today, because it's actually the most common mode of public transport. Trains dominate the media because it's quite a London and South East centric issue. A lot of journalists and a lot of politicians catch the train very often, but actually 4 times as many people catch the bus every week than they do the train. And it is predominantly those who don't have access to a car, who are the least well off, that rely on the bus the most, and yet they receive so little public attention. That's why we've committed to offering every community in the country the ability to take back control over their routes, fares and services, just as we've seen happen in Greater Manchester and just as London has had for many years now, so that they can actually set the routes that they want to see and set the fares that they think are reasonable for their local communities. We're the only country in the entire developed world that hands private bus operators all the power they want to set whatever routes they want and set whatever fares they want. And we're seeing the consequence of this now, which is that more than half of our routes have disappeared over the last 13 years. And that has had profound consequences, particularly for those who can least afford it.
Presumably, Louise, as well as changing regulation, there would need to be more investment in order to open up some of these closed bus routes as well?
Well, look, we think the priority has to be reforming a broken system. As I say, we're allowing these private operators complete power and control to set whatever routes they want and whatever fares they want. That means that on commercially viable routes, they are over-competing and they're crowding each other out, and they're leaving vast swathes of the network to go completely uncovered. That's led to appalling inefficiencies, and we see when certain areas have moved to franchising, like Jersey not so long ago, that it actually lowers the price of the contract, and that means that you can invest in those routes that haven't been traditionally served. We're also committed to proper public ownership if local authorities want to take ownership of those bus companies. Like Nottingham, for example, just prior to COVID, the publicly owned Nottingham bus service was actually returning a dividend to their local authority. So we know that when it is properly run and when it is properly accountable and properly owned, then public transport can not only be in the public interest in terms of the service, it can be in the public interest of the taxpayer as well.
Finally, Louise, we've been talking about migration today, in front of the Daily Mail. Suella, I'll wage war on crooked migration lawyers. The government is saying that the people who are not being allowed to go onto the BB Stockholm today in Portland are being held off by the actions of lawyers, crooked lawyers. What they're actually saying is Labour lawyers. This is an attempt to say this is Labour behind these attempts to stop the government tackling migration. Is that fair?
I think, as I heard Kevin say just before I came on that the government are attempting to portray the Bibby Stockholm as a success or as a solution, but it's nothing more than a catastrophic symbol of their own failure over the last 13 years. The only people they can look to for their failure to tackle the asylum system and the fact that over 170,000 people, that's 10 times more than when Labour left office, are awaiting asylum application is themselves. And the fact that they're desperately attempting to blame the party that's been in opposition for 13 years shows that they've got no real solutions to the crisis that they themselves have created.
All the lawyers who are making up false applications, that's not something you're going to defend?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously... No, of course not. And our Shadow Attorney General, Emily Thornberry, said as soon as that story came out that those solicitors should be referred to the Solicitors Regulation Authority. That's happened. We welcome the task force today. But look, that is not the reason why we have over 170,000 people waiting to be processed by the Home Office. They're processing fewer people than they did last year. They're deporting 70% fewer people than they did under the last Labour government. They've got no plans to tackle the backlog. All they're doing is pursuing these wedge culture issues in a desperate attempt to deflect and divert from responsibility for the crisis that they themselves have created.
Louise Haigh, Shadow Transport Secretary, we'll leave you to go and get your bus into your constituency office, and thank you for joining us.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because even when Bibby Stockholm was being branded as a fire hazard, there were sort of briefings that, you know, the Fire Brigades Union are left-leaning, they're Labour. You know, there's all this idea that any obstruction to the government's plans to deal with asylum seekers, any obstruction, whether it's legal, whether it's this concern for welfare, whatever, is all being pushed underneath by Labour.
Infamy, infamy. They've all got it in for me. Remember Kenneth Williams, Carry On Cleopatra? It's Carry On the Conservatives out.
I mean, look, I'm meant to be the Tory spokesman on this show, but I do find it hard. I was surprised, I have to say. I'm getting slightly sort of exasperated by this. You know, the Fire Brigades Union or the fire officer in a local community is there to give advice on the safety of buildings. And I think that, you know, that there's a tendency, if you kind of strike out like that, you undermine the authority of a very, very important part of the ecosystem, because fire officers go to schools and talk about safety. They go and help people make their homes safer. And if I was a local councillor or a local politician and the local fire officer was saying this is a fire hazard, I would listen to them rather than slag them off in the papers.
Questioning the neutrality of experts has become a theme.
I just think it has consequences that I don't want to see.
Oliver Dowden, the Deputy Prime Minister, who made that smear, he's not fit to lace the boots of firefighters when he's playing that gutter politics.
Look, we've got to find something for Lord Vaizey to defend about the Conservative Party. There's got to be something for him to defend.
And luckily... £42 tax-free day in the House of Lords.
Luckily, Ed, on TikTok, Matt Hancock has delivered.
I haven't had a chance.
Hang on, I think we've got a chance.
Can I just say? I'm going to be honest with you. When he just said Matt Hancock on TikTok, the whole gallery groaned. Oh no!
We want to see it.
They've been watching it all night. They're now going to watch it again.
Come on, let's see it. Ed, a former MP.
The Tory Party
is this the path to choose?
Ed, the Tory Party is one of the most foremost electoral winning machines in modern British political history. And what you see here is a great demonstration of a prominent Tory politician cutting through to a new audience using the latest communication techniques on social media. I think that's something that we should celebrate. It's a total triumph.
Has he still got his app? Does Matt Hancock have his own app?
No, he discontinued because no one wanted to use it.
Oh, what a shame.
He's having a late midlife crisis.
He's not that's it. Yeah. He's not even a Tory MP anymore.
I know, well, he still is technically, like Nadine Dorries.
I thought he had the whip taken away from him.
Remind me.
Good point.
I think he's out.
Yes.
I don't think
I can't remember.
He was held
You're defending the Tory Party.
What you see there is an independent MP.
He was health secretary during COVID. Just let's try and get our heads why it went so wrong.
Yeah. OK. Can I just say, that video has had 3 million views, so I think he's quite happy with it.
I've been at public events with Matt Hancock where a lot of people who wouldn't cross the street to talk to any politician have asked for selfies.
There's the infamy of anti-celebrity. Right,
and indeed, Ed Balls has shown the way. I mean, politicians can pioneer in popular culture.
Hang on, you can sue if he's liking you, Matt Hancock.
OK.
Have a look at the Ed Vaizey TikTok account is available to all viewers.